何かを作る、何かを育てるのはいいぞ。いろんなことが見えるし分かってくる。楽しいこととかな。
For as long as I can remember, Ryoji Kaji has been my favorite character in Neon Genesis Evangelion. Over the last few years, where the only consistent thing about my feelings on the series has been inconsistency, my fascination and admiration for him has been one of the only constants. And it's a little bit difficult to put into words exactly why this is, but it has something to do with the ingenious way in which he's so efficiently utilized, using substantial but minimalistic implications to allow him to have such a lasting impact on the story, despite being used relatively sparingly, primarily because of how resonant the concepts associated with him are. Just as a disclaimer, as is the case with any of my videos, I'm not saying that any of my interpretations are 100% correct, but that is doubly true and especially worth noting with a series like Eva. I'm something of a novice when it comes to this story, and I wouldn't pretend to know nearly as much as those who have been deeply ruminating on and analyzing it for years, so I could definitely be missing something or just be entirely wrong about Kaji. A lot of this is pretty dependent on interpretations of what is implied, and on filling in some gaps with very personal opinion. But I do have a little bit to say about him that I wanted to share, because I find him to be such an engaging character, and if nothing else, I just hope to facilitate some discussion on him. Kaji is introduced into the story and initially teased as a sort of free-spirited, semi-chaos factor, and that isn't a totally inaccurate thing to say about him. He's an insatiable flirt, he jokes, he's outwardly jovial, and he's eventually revealed to be a double, triple, quadruple agent, and all of this lends credence to the idea of him being the classic, devilishly smiling rogue character. Someone with their own selfish agenda, extremely well put together and psychologically pristine, in contrast to the other broken characters in the story. But that isn't quite the case. In episode 15, we see the first time that Kaji really lets the carefree persona slip. When a drunk Misato chastises herself and pours her heart out to him. He's so clearly pained by her self-deprecation that it flicks a switch, and he becomes the most serious we've seen him, which is quite a shock. And this sort of thing happens again, though in a much less dramatic and much more contemplative context. In episode 17, where he talks about his watermelon hobby to Shinji, and in episode 18, where he shares some wisdom about understanding others, and so on and so forth. These allusions to this deeper sense of self hint at the idea that the scoundrel demeanor is somewhat of a mask, particularly when you examine how fixated he is on the idea of honesty.
情欲に溺れてる方が人間としてリアルだ。少しは欺けるさ。
うちの諜報部を、それとも碇氏でやりつか、それとも私。
いや、自分を。
Throughout the story, we see Kaji consistently referring to this idea. The thought that he's incapable of sincere truth, that he tries to fool himself into believing that he can feel and love and express himself and communicate as much as he wishes he could. There's a distinct juxtaposition in comparing the self-assured, confident scoundrel and the man who muses multiple times about the nature of understanding others and about how unsure he is that he even knows himself. My interpretation is that it's easy for him to revert and slip into the sexual, flirtatious deviant, because it's the part he plays the most and the one that he's most comfortable with. Does he hide behind it? Maybe. But despite this, and despite not always being outwardly honest, he doesn't often lie, and when he does, he's usually so bad at it that he gives it away anyway. He withholds truths and acts deceivingly, but rarely tells mistruths and often hints at the direction of the answer someone's looking for. So despite his facades, in interactions he isn't usually dishonest, and I don't think he wants to be. To be clear, I'm not saying that this mask that he leans on isn't a part of who he is, because I think saying that it isn't is undercutting a big part of his identity. Kaji is a bold flirt, without a doubt, and given his thoughts on truth, I don't think that he'd be able to bear gallivanting around as someone entirely removed from who he is so often. But there is also an untapped side to him, a reflective one that we don't usually see that only rears itself with Misato and Shinji. And although these occasions increase in frequency as his journey nears its end, the rarity of these glimpses is part of what makes them so meaningful.
人は他人を完全には理解できない。自分自身だって怪しいもんさ。100% 理解し合うのは不可能なんだよ。まあ、だからこそ人は自分を他人を知ろうと努力する。だから面白いんだな、人生は。
At heart, Kaji is deeply empathetic, sensitive, and compassionate. He adores the idea of connecting with others, and has clearly put much thought into what it means to try to communicate. As he says, we may not ever be able to understand each other 100%, and that is very sad if you think about it. But the great thing about this is that we can still try. Through trying to struggle through the gaps in our understanding, we can persevere and reach out to become closer to each other. And there is a flawed beauty in that.
辛いのは嫌いか？
好きじゃないです。
楽しいことを見つけたかい？それもいいさ。けど辛いことを知ってる人間の方がそれだけ人に優しくできる。それは弱さとは違うからな。
Without pain, we have little to no capacity to understand the suffering of others, to help them and grow closer to them. As such, it's counterproductive to avoid it, and it's something of a conduit to so many great things about life. But no matter how close Kaji himself gets to others, he doesn't really feel this closeness as much as he feels he should, and this makes him bear a huge burden through his inability to understand why. He loves the idea of these feelings, but he can't really experience them himself. Kaji is indeed very wise and deeply in tune with the struggles and truths of the human condition that the other characters often can't come to grips with, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't have his own struggles with these things. He wants to feel close to others, and he wants to look for that intimate, gentle touch, because all he feels is a detachment. He's something of a contradiction, and it's an extremely painful thing for him. He plays roles to further his professional interests because that's all he feels he can follow since he doubts the sincerity of his feelings. He's someone so caught up in lies, intrigue, and deceptions, but he feels hollow about it. He cares for Misato, but doesn't know if it's true love or if he's even capable of that. He parades his sexuality around, but reveals that a big reason for doing it is as a desperate attempt to play at being human. An attempt to fool himself into feeling. Clearly looking troubled, we hear him speak about the flimsiness of hearsay and the futility of believing in deceptions. And as mentioned before, through his talks with Shinji, we can see that he clearly understands that being genuine can be extremely hurtful too. But I get the feeling that the falsities that represent the former trouble him much more than honest pain. I think it's clear that he yearns for this. In episode 21, he frees Fuyutsuki and says in reply to the idea of his life being forfeit that he just wants to get to the truth. But not the truth of nerve or sele or instrumentality. He wants the truth of himself. He wants to learn about how he truly feels and who he is through discovering these secrets and following his heart and gut. And it makes me wonder if he ever reached this understanding by the end. I really hope he did.
君か。ご無沙汰です。外の見張りにはしばらく眠ってもらいました。
この行動は君の命取りになるぞ。
真実に近づきたいだけなんです。僕の中のね。
Either way, with all of this in mind, it's easy to understand a big part of why Kaji loves nurturing his watermelons and seeing them grow. There is the fact that he's a compassionate and empathetic person, and this is a simple way of expressing that. There's also the idea that the simplicity of this sort of thing is a welcome reprieve from the complex, dark, and scary political machinations that make up his everyday life. But I think the biggest reason relates back to his ideas on sincere connection. He knows that a huge part of being human is forming bonds with anything, and he's very fond of that idea. Of nurturing things, namely relationships, and slowly but surely building real connections. It's just that he doesn't feel like he can do it with others. But growing his own food, that's easy. And the results bear fruit. The main thing Kaji wants to do in his life is see proof of his true love reflected in his relationships. Yet, since he doubts his ability to do this, he's totally blind to his impact on others. But his watermelons are a concrete, observable manifestation of his affection. They're proof that he can care for something, no matter how small, and that's extremely calming to him. It helps him feel that he's a human being who's capable of genuine, unfiltered compassion, and in the end, that's the only mark on the world that he really cares about. With all this in mind, it's no wonder that he'd be perfectly at peace with everything if he could just die with his plants, his labors of love. For him, there's a serenity in that. And as such, it's also no surprise that he asked Misato to continue to grow them and to maintain that mark after he was gone. Because, along with simply caring about them and wanting them to grow and prosper, they're evidence that Ryoji Kaji was a loving human. And he left that mark on Misato through his encouragement to her to get to the truth of things, and more importantly, through his sheer presence and spirit in her life. But I don't believe he realized how much his attempts to get through to her on an intimate level really worked. Though of course, there's always the chance that it got through to her simply because she craved that connection. And it's something of a tragedy that the two never really got to talk about this, because maybe it could have salvaged something incredibly special. But as he says, no two humans can ever understand each other 100%. Having said that, even apart from the small solace he took from caring for his plants, I really believe that Kaji was mistaken in thinking that he wasn't sincere or loving. Kaji is caught up with change. He's sentimental. He fixates on Misato maturing and growing up and wearing heels. He thinks back to more innocent times with a sad smile and dwells in nostalgia. And that isn't the type of thing that an uncaring person would do. Despite his sexual scenes, for me the most romantically authentic we ever see him is far removed from those, again when he kisses Misato. Solemn and deadly serious and honest in trying to comfort her. It seems to me like the less he tries to feel, the more he naturally lets his guard down and subconsciously experiences what he longed for. I think that a desire to care is a genuine form of caring, and that Kaji just wasn't able to conceptualize those feelings as what he was looking for all this time. Because you can't tell me that the man who so earnestly begged Misato to stop criticizing herself, who constantly spoke to Shinji about why life is worth living and how important it is to keep struggling to understand others, just didn't care. I think that he really did care all this time. It's just that he was so buried beneath his jobs and personas that he never really came to grips with what it felt like to love in the way he championed. And although he may have seen his watermelons as the only tangible proof of this love, he was mistaken with that too. Because his words and actions profoundly impacted the lives of all those around him, and his philosophy is one that would steer a potential new age in very good stead. Many thanks for watching.
あなた人のことには興味ないもの。そのくせ寂しがる。